I have great pleasure to introduce John Mearsheimer, who will be speaking today on America's Imperial Impulse.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Brian. And thank you very much for inviting me here to Carleton to speak today. And thank you all for coming out to listen to me talk. The subject I'm going to talk about today, of course, is America's Imperial Impulse. And what I'd like you to do is sort of go back about 22 years to 1989, 1990, when the Cold War ended. And the United States felt like it was on top of the world. Most of you in the audience are really too young to remember that. In fact, I'm envious of you because you're too young to remember that. But let me assure you that back in 1989, 1990, 1991, there was real euphoria in the United States. And that euphoria, I think, is best reflected in two very famous articles that were written at the time. The first was Francis Fukuyama's famous article, The End of History. And anybody who has not read The End of History should really go back and read it. But Frank's argument in The End of History was that the United States had spent the first half of the 20th century fighting against fascism, and it had decisively defeated fascism. And then in the second half of the 20th century, it had fought against communism. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, communism had been decisively defeated. And the end result was that liberal democracy had triumphed. And Frank made the argument, and this is a quote from The End of History, that liberal democracy was, quote, the final form of human government. In other words, it was inevitable that the rest of the world would come to look like the United States and Canada. The rest of the world would eventually become democratic because there was no alternative. And of course, as you all know, because most Americans, and this included Frank Fukuyama, believed that America is a peaceful country and that it's everybody else that causes trouble around the world, not the United States. If the rest of the world looked like the United States, it would be a very boring place. There would be very little conflict, very little war, right? And you would have a world populated by peaceful democracies. And as Frank said, the biggest problem that we would face in that world would be boredom. And of course, this translates into the title of the piece, The End of History. That was one famous article that was written. The other famous article that was written by another neoconservative, by the way. Frank was a neoconservative at the time. But the other one was written by Charles Krauthammer. And Charles Krauthammer's piece was entitled The Unipolar Moment. And his argument was that the United States, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, had emerged from the Cold War as by far the most powerful state on the planet, militarily. And in fact, if you look carefully at this situation, we had never seen a case in recorded history where any one country had as much power, military power, as the United States. That was to say, we didn't just have a big stick, we had a mighty big stick. Okay? Now, the story I'm going to tell you is that what happened over the next 20 years was many Americans in the national security elite came to the conclusion that because, as Frank Fukuyama told us, we had history on our side, because the wind was at our back, and because, as Charles Krauthammer said, we had this giant stick in our hands, right? We could use that stick to propel the process forward. We could, in effect, speed up remaking the world in our own image. And in the process, of course, we would become a global hegemon. And of course, this would be all for the good because, as you know, the Americans and Canadians share this view for the most part. Americans and Canadians think of themselves as the good guys. And if everybody ends up looking like us, how else could you avoid having anything but happiness? Or as I like to say, peace, love, and dope. So that was the world of the early 1990s. We were full of, to put it in rather crude terms, piss and vinegar. But things have not gone well. They have not gone well at all for the United States of America. Fortunately, you've had the good sense to avoid most of our escapades. But we've had a really tough time of it. We're in a real mess today. Do you realize that the United States of America has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended? 2 out of every 3 years. The war in Afghanistan is the longest war in our history. Not only that, we're going to lose in Afghanistan, and we've lost in Iraq. These are failed enterprises. We've got 3 other major foreign policy problems where we appear to be going backwards. One is Iran, right? It's a total mess. Second is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where we've been pushing for a 2-state solution. Total failure. And third is getting North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. Another failure. It's really quite remarkable. And furthermore, when you look at domestic consequences of our foreign policy over the past 20 years, we've gotten heavily into torturing people. We've done all sorts of things that are antithetical to American values. We've created a national security state in the United States, as the Founding Fathers fully understood. There's no way you can be at war 2 out of every 3 years and not create a national security state. Right? Furthermore, we've spent huge amounts of money on defense, and we have these raging budget deficits because we decided that not only do we not have to raise taxes, we could cut taxes and drastically increase defense spending to fight these wars, and it would have no negative effects. Surprise of surprises, it didn't turn out that way. But the American economy is in terrible shape, in part because of our foreign policy, not completely, but in part. Right? In terms of civil liberties, almost all of my friends agree, and they're Obama supporters, that President Obama is worse on civil liberties than George W. Bush. Given a choice, I'd take George W. Bush over Barack Obama in a second on civil liberties. Right? It's a real mess. This is a real mess. And the question you want to ask yourself is, what went wrong? Right? Again, go back 20 years and look at all that euphoria, and fast forward 20 years and look at the mess we're in down south of the border, and you say to yourself, what went wrong? How did this happen? Got all this intellectual capital in the United States, all these people with PhDs from fancy universities and law degrees from fancy universities. We're supposed to be smart. It sure doesn't look like we're very smart, at least to me. Looks like we've made a real hash of things. The question is, what went wrong? Now, my argument is that to understand what went wrong, you have to start with grand strategy. Right? And the United States made a fundamental mistake in its choice of grand strategy when the Cold War ended. And then, after September 11th, we made 3 huge errors which made things even worse. So what I want to do is I want to talk to you about American grand strategy. And this is a very American-centric worldview, but I'm trying to explain to you why the United States screwed up so badly here. So, of course, I'm going to talk about American grand strategy. And then I'll talk about the 3 big mistakes that we made after September 11th. Talk about grand strategy. There are basically 4 grand strategies that any American leader can choose among. The first, which is politically incorrect, but which is intellectually very powerful, is isolationism. And isolationism says, and you want to be very attentive here, isolation does not say that the United States is not politically and economically involved in the world. That's not what isolationists say. Isolationists say that the United States should not fight any wars outside of the Western Hemisphere. We should not be militarily engaged outside of the Western Hemisphere. And the argument for that is that there are no threats outside of the Western Hemisphere that can reach us, because we are separated by 2 giant moats from Europe and Asia, and really from the rest of the world. We are therefore safe. The modern version of this is we're even more secure than we used to be, because not only do we still have those two moats, we now have thousands of nuclear weapons. Please explain to me how China is going to get to San Francisco. Normandy 2 across the Pacific Ocean? How's Nazi Germany or Imperial Germany going to get to Long Island? Normandy 2 across the Atlantic Ocean? Cut me a break, right? And then you throw nuclear weapons into the equation? This is the argument that when the Cold War ended, we should have just closed up shop and come home. Who's going to get at us? We're Godzilla. Godzilla, separated by these moats from the rest of the world and owning huge numbers of nuclear weapons. It's a very powerful argument. Okay? But it's politically incorrect. But that was one option. Second option is my favorite option, which is called offshore balancing. Americans, according to offshore balancers, believe that there are three areas of the world worth expending blood and iron for. Those three areas of the world are Europe, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Otherwise, the United States should not expend blood and iron in any areas of the world. Europe and Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia to a lesser extent, are very important because that's where the great powers are. It's where China is, Japan, Germany, France, Russia. And the Gulf is important because of oil. Okay, those are the three areas of the world you fight and die for. Offshore balancers say the only time you fight in those regions is when there is one state that threatens to dominate the region and the local states cannot control it. Soviet Union after World War II is incredibly powerful. It's just played the key role in defeating the Third Reich, right? And there's no European great power that can contain the Soviet Union. France is in shambles. Germany, of course, is in total shambles. Britain is in no position to contain the Soviet Union. So the United States has to do the heavy lifting. We have to come on shore. But otherwise, we stay offshore. In 1910, when Imperial Germany is rising, the United States relies on the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia, to contain Imperial Germany. And we actually don't come on shore until April 1917. The idea is you remain offshore, and you only come on shore if the local powers cannot contain that potential hegemon. Very limited strategy, okay? That's offshore balancing. Third grand strategy, right? Third grand strategy is somewhat different than offshore balancing. It's called selective engagement. And it agrees with offshore balancing in that it says there are three areas of the world that matter, and those are the same areas that the offshore balancers identify: Europe, Asia, and the Gulf. However, selective engagers say that the United States should stay permanently engaged in those three areas to prevent war from breaking out. Remember, the offshore balancers said what you care about is potential hegemons, and that's when you come in, when they can't be contained. The selective engagers say you stay in those areas of the world and you maintain peace. Let me give you an example to highlight this. When the Cold War ended, John said, let's get out of Europe. Okay, I wanted to bring all the troops home, and I want to spend all that money we spend in Europe on building infrastructure in Chicago. That's what I wanted to do, right? I didn't want to spend it on defending Europeans. Most of my realist friends who are not offshore balancers, who are selective engagers, said we have to stay in Europe and we have to maintain peace in Europe. Because if war breaks out, we'll get sucked in anyway, so let's just stay there and prevent it. Okay, that's their view. And they carried the day. We have stayed in Europe. We have stayed in Northeast Asia, stayed in Korea, stayed in Japan. That's the selective engagement argument. Again, isolationism says outside the Western Hemisphere, there is no area that is strategically important to the United States. Offshore balancers say there are three areas, but you only care about those areas when there's a potential hegemon. Selective engagers say there are these same three areas, but you got to stay there to maintain the peace in those three areas. The fourth grand strategy, and this is the important one, is we'll discuss it. The fourth grand strategy is global dominance. And this is the idea that the entire globe is of great strategic importance to the United States. And what we Americans have to do is dominate the entire globe. We have to be a global hegemon. Now, given what I told you about Fukuyama and Krauthammer, right, what happened in the United States from roughly 1990 up to the present, I would argue, is that we have pursued global dominance. Okay? Now, it's very important to understand that there are two kinds of people who support global dominance. One are the neoconservatives, and two are the liberal imperialists. A good example of the neoconservatives would be Paul Wolfowitz, and a good example of the liberal imperialists would be Madeleine Albright. Right? These are good representatives of both schools. There's not a whole heck of a lot of difference between the two of them or between the two schools. Both of them have the same end goal, which is global dominance. Okay? But the strategies or the means that they're interested in using to achieve those goals are different. Not completely, but somewhat. And here's the difference. The neoconservatives dislike international institutions and allies intensely. And what they like is unilateralism. They believe that allies just get in the way, especially Europeans, who are basically a bunch of wussies in their worldview, right, and don't want to fight, right? They also believe, and Charles Krauthammer is a good example of this, that American military power can be used in all sorts of ways to achieve America's goals. Okay? So they privilege military force and they diminish the importance of institutions and allies. That's the neoconservatives. The liberal imperialists, on the other hand, this is people like Madeleine Albright, I think Hillary Clinton fits in this category. They tend to be more wary of what you can do with military force. And they tend to place more emphasis on international institutions. And as you all know, a euphemism for international institutions is multilateralism, right? So it's multilateralism for the liberal imperialists and unilateralism for the neoconservatives. And unilateralism goes along with the big stick. And multilateralism, you need allies, you need institutions, there are limits to what the big stick can do. So those are the differences. And to go to sort of what has actually happened in America since 1992, President Bill Clinton, who was the President of the United States, of course, for 8 years, was basically a liberal imperialist, and he was surrounded by liberal imperialists. Most of you are too young to remember this, but George Bush, when he ran for president in 2000, ran as a realist. He ran as a selective engager. He said that the Clinton administration had been too interested in imperial mission. It had been too interested in nation building. We had to pull in our horns, right? Restore our old-fashioned alliances and so forth and so on. But then, after September 11th, he became effectively a neoconservative in his foreign policy. Okay? So what you have here is a story where from January 1993, when Bill Clinton became president, up until when he stopped being president in January 2001, the United States had a powerful liberal imperialist impulse. And then, save for a brief period, right, where selective engagers were in control, the neoconservatives took over, right? And Bush and Cheney adopted a neoconservative agenda. And the United States got itself into a whole heck of a lot of trouble, right? It had gotten itself in a considerable amount of trouble during the Clinton years, but nothing too serious. But after September 11th, we got into a lot of trouble. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But the big picture that I want to put in your heads at this point is that you have to understand that when you live in a country like the United States, right, that is physically separated from the rest of the world by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and you have a great deal of military might, you have choices that you can make about which areas of the world you care about, what kinds of military forces you're going to build, and when you're going to fight in those different areas. This is what grand strategy is all about, right? And it's a subject Americans have historically paid a lot of attention to. And what I'm telling you is that when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union went away, and the United States did not have any country out there that appeared to be a peer competitor, we had lots of choices. We could have come home very easily. We did not. We could have pursued selective engagement. We could have gone back to being an offshore balancer, which is the way I like to do business. Okay? But we did not decide to pursue any of those three grand strategies. We decided to pursue global dominance. And what I'm telling you is that if you look at what was in the ether at the time, what was in the ether was Frank Fukuyama and Charles Krauthammer. I'm not saying that it was their articles that explain everything by any means, but their articles encapsulate the optimism of the time. Okay? Now, as I said to you, I think during the Clinton years, we got ourselves into trouble here and there, Somalia being a very good example. But by and large, we avoided disasters. But after September 11th, the United States got into a whole heck of a lot of trouble when the neoconservatives sold their agenda to Bush and to Cheney. Now, what happened? How is it that things went so badly? I think we made three fundamental errors, and I want to spend some time talking about all three of these errors. First of all, we misunderstood the terrorist threat. Number one. Number two, we greatly overestimated the utility of military force. We came to the conclusion, not me, but most Americans, came to the conclusion that you could do wondrous things with that big stick. It's a very non-Clausewitzian view of military power. Good realists like me pay a lot of attention to Clausewitz. Clausewitz's basic argument is that military conflict or war is the realm of unintended consequences, right? Bad things happen when you go to war. You have all these grand schemes, and they usually go down the toilet bowl very quickly. You want to be very careful when you get into wars. That was not the way we were thinking. I'll explain why in due course, right? But number one, we misunderstood the terrorist threat. Number two, we failed to appreciate the limits of military force. And third, we amazingly greatly overestimated how easy it would be to spread democracy in the Middle East. Okay. Let me go through these matters in great detail. First of all, let me talk about the terrorist threat. Made a number of big mistakes about the terrorist threat. First of all, we decided after we got hit on September 11th that we were going to not only deal with Al-Qaeda, we're going to make every terrorist organization on the face of the earth our enemy. This is all part of the global war on terrorism. You've heard of that, the GWAT, right? You would have thought that we would have focused laser-like on Al-Qaeda and said terrorism is, generally speaking, not a good thing. We don't like Hezbollah. We don't like this group. We don't like that group. But that's for others to deal. Those groups are for others to deal with. We're going to focus on Al-Qaeda. That was not our strategy. Our strategy was that we were going to deal with terrorism all across the globe. It was the global war on terrorism. And of course, as you remember, people like Norman Podhoretz said that this was the equivalent of World War IV. Just think about the words he's using. World War IV. The entire world. We're fighting globally. Second, related to this, they decided that not only were we going to go after terrorist groups, but we were going to go after a whole bunch of rogue states that they believed were joined at the hip with the terrorist groups. And this, of course, included countries like Iraq, Iran, and Syria. right? These are the so-called rogue states. And most of you are old enough to remember the run-up to the Iraq War. The Bush administration went to enormous lengths to make the argument that Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, or Al-Qaeda and Iraq, were joined at the hip, that they were part of a seamless web. And we could not just get Al-Qaeda. We had to get Iraq as well. And of course we had to get Iran. We had to get the rogue states. Right? So instead of dealing with the group that attacked us on September 11th alone, we decided we're going to deal with every terrorist group on the planet, and we're going to deal with all these rogue states that we believed were allied, even though they weren't, with these terrorist organizations. And this is the genesis of the global war on terrorism. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a war that's almost impossible to win. Second mistake that we made, second big mistake in assessing the threat, is we greatly overestimated the terrorist threat to the United States. It is really hard to believe how severe the threat inflation is when you talk about terrorism. There's no question that Al-Qaeda got a lucky hit on September 11th and did an enormous amount of damage in the United States. I don't want to make light of that, but it was a one-time event. They were trying to hit us before September 11th. Remember, they attacked the World Trade Center in early 1993, right? And they have obviously been trying to hit us since then, and they have not been successful. I am not saying that the United States does not face a terrorist threat. But the question you have to ask yourself is, how serious is this terrorist threat? Is this an existential threat? It doesn't even come close to being an existential threat. The idea that this is World War IV is laughable. It's laughable. As John Mueller points out, the number of Americans killed by terrorism since the late 1960s. The number of Americans killed by international terrorists since the late 1960s is roughly the same number as those killed by lightning, those killed by accident-causing deer, and those killed by severe allergic reaction to peanuts. I mean, who are we worried about here? The shoe bomber? Did you go to bed at night worrying about the shoe bomber? Or maybe the underwear bomber. Or maybe it's the combination of the shoe bomber and the underwear bomber. Where is this great terrorist threat to the United States? Again, they did get it a lucky shot on September 11th. And we've now taken all sorts of precautions to make sure that that happens again. But the idea that you're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on defense to deal with the shoe bomber, or to deal with the underwear bomber, I don't get it. Right? Well, you know how many people died in World War II? By my calculation, 50 million. 50 million. World War II was a serious business. I believe that Nazi Germany was an existential threat. Right? The idea that Al-Qaeda is an existential threat is laughable. It's just laughable. But anyway, we created the impression that Al-Qaeda was the equivalent of Nazi Germany or Imperial Germany or Imperial Japan or the Soviet Union. It was going to be World War IV. And furthermore, we decided we're not only going to go after Al-Qaeda, we're going to go after all of these regimes, so-called rogue regimes, as well as other terrorist organizations. But those weren't the two biggest problems in our assessment of the threat. The biggest problem is that we misunderstood. You want to pay very careful attention to this, because this is an issue of enormous importance. We misunderstood why they hate us. Right? First question you want to ask yourself in dealing with what happened on September 11th is, why did they come after us? There are two answers to why they came after us. Two possible answers. One is, they came after us because they hate who we are. They hate our values. They hate democracy. They hate Christianity. They hate the fact that we treat women equal with men, right? These kinds of arguments, that they hate who we are. The other possible explanation is that they hate us because of our policies. Specifically, they hate us because we kept American troops in Saudi Arabia after 1991. They hate us because we support Israel's brutal repression of the Palestinians. They hate us because we had sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s that by almost all accounts killed at least 500,000 innocent people. They hate us because we've supported repressive regimes in the Middle East in places like Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. They hate our policies. Now, the evidence here is overwhelming. It's overwhelming that they hate us because of our policies. There is a huge amount of survey data, and there's all sorts of testimony, which includes Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's testimony to the September 11th Commission as to why he engineered the attacks. The evidence is overwhelming that they hate us because of our policies, not because of who we are. Okay? But the United States of America did not conclude that they hate us because of our policies, because if we concluded that they hated us because of our policies, then we would bear some responsibility for what happened on September 11th. If it was our policy, it was things we were doing in the Arab and Islamic world that caused them to attack us, it would be much harder to say we are right and they are wrong. So of course we had to say they hate us because of who we are. Well, once you say they hate us because of who we are, you have two choices. One, you can change who you are, or two, you can change who they are. And which one do you think we decided to pursue? Think about the Bush Doctrine. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. This segues very nicely into the discussion of the military instrument. We came to the conclusion that they hated us because of who we are, and therefore we had to use military force. This is the Krauthammer stick, right? To go into the Middle East and change who they are. Make them into liberal democracies. Remember what Frank Fukuyama said? Remember what he said, the final form of human government. It's going to eventually happen everywhere. Democracy is going to break out. We're just going to facilitate the process. So this is what the Bush administration was all about. It was all about using military force to transform who they were. And of course, once that happens, they won't hate us. They'll love us because we all look the same. Again, go back and read the Fukuyama piece. Very important. Okay? So we fundamentally misunderstood the terrorist threat. Right? Second problem is we didn't understand the limits of military force. And this is a very interesting story. If you're going to go around the world using that big stick to knock off governments and put in place leaders and systems that are democratic at their core, you have to be able to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. In other words, you have to have a military that can go into Afghanistan, take down the regime, install a friendly leader and a stable political system, get out, reload the shotgun, go into Iraq, take down Saddam, put in a friendly regime, get out, reload the shotgun, go into Iran. To put it in Muhammad Ali's terms again, you got to be able to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. You get bogged down in the briar patch, you can't do it. You understand? Some of you are too young to remember this. The Bush Doctrine, very important here. The Bush Doctrine was designed to reorder the entire Middle East at the end of a rifle barrel. It was not just Iraq. Iraq was the first stop on the train line. By the way, in early 2002, when the Israelis got wind that we were thinking about doing Iraq next, because we had just done Afghanistan, the Israelis were beside themselves because they said Iran is the real danger. So a bunch of Israelis from the government got on a plane, came to Washington, and said, you got to do Iran, not Iraq. The administration and its allies said, relax. We're going to do Iraq, then we're going to do Iran, and then we're going to do Syria, right? We're going with the low-hanging fruit first. You've heard that phrase? The low-hanging fruit. Iraq is the low-hanging fruit. Anyway. Right? But you want to remember what I said. You've got to be able to go into Iraq, take the government down, put in a replacement regime that's stable and friendly very quickly so you can get out and then do Iran and then do Syria. You get bogged down, you can't do that. Okay. So then the question becomes, why did we think that we could float like a butterfly and sting like a bee? Right? And the answer is what happened in Afghanistan between October 2001, right, and early 2002. Here's the basic story. We get hit on September 11th, 2001. We go into Afghanistan. We start the war in Afghanistan in mid-October. By late November, it looks like we have not only toppled the Taliban, but we are going to be able to put a government in place that will be able to rule Afghanistan, and we will have stability there. And we will be able to get out of town. By the end of December, the Taliban is defeated, and the Karzai government is in place, and the United States leaves. And the United States then begins to think about doing Iraq. And what we think we're going to do in Iraq is what we did in Afghanistan. Remember Chalabi? Chalabi was going to be our man in Iraq. We were going to topple Saddam. Chalabi was going to be put in his place. We're going to have democracy in Iraq, and then we're on to the next target. Okay. But what happened was we misread what had happened in Afghanistan. And here's how we misread it. It was not a decisive victory. It was a temporary victory. And here is why we're going to lose in Afghanistan. And here is why we were doomed from the start. We didn't realize this at the time. We thought we had found the magic formula that would allow us to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. We thought we had the magic formula. But we misread Afghanistan. Here's the problem. Twofold. The first problem is we could not decisively defeat the Taliban. We could knock them out of power, but they melted away into the countryside, and many of them, as you know, went across the border into Pakistan. That meant that at some point down the road, they'd rise from the dead and come back to fight another day. See, when you fight Germany in World War II, it's a decisive defeat. When you fight Japan in World War II, it's a decisive defeat. We just finished them off. Decisive. We did not decisively defeat the Taliban. We whacked them good. Don't misunderstand me. It took them a number of years to come back from the dead. But we did not finish them off. And they would eventually come back from the dead. Second problem we have, which is inextricably bound up with that first problem, is that we put this guy named Hamid Karzai in power in Kabul. He is, number one, inefficient. This is a guy who would have difficulty, right, getting three boys from my office to the men's room because he'd have to open a door. Right? And secondly, he's corrupt. That means that when the Taliban comes back from the dead, it's going to be the Karzai government that is responsible for dealing with the Taliban. And a government that is inefficient and corrupt is not going to have any legitimacy. And you know what that means? Uncle Sugar is going to have to come back into the war to fight it. And that, of course, is exactly what happened. Remember the Obama surge in Afghanistan? And the buildup was starting even before
Obama became president. Why was it beginning? Because the Taliban was coming back from the dead, and the Karzai government, which was inefficient and corrupt, could not deal with it. So Uncle Sugar had to come back in. But what happens? For old dogs like me who served in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which is coterminous with the Vietnam War, we remember what happened back then. We were supporting a government that was, number one, inefficient, and number two, corrupt. It had no legitimacy, and we had no legitimacy. And fighting out in the countryside was a lost cause. Well, there you go. But let's go back to January, February, March 2002. Nobody understands that the victory in Afghanistan is a mirage. And instead, we think we've got the magic formula. So when you tell the Bush people, you better not go into Iraq because the story's not going to end happily, they say, you told us the same thing when we went into Afghanistan. And that one ended happily. We're going to go in there, take down the tyrant, democracy's going to break out, we're going to put our man in charge, and then we're off to the next target. They were wrong. They were wrong. First of all, they quickly jumped into a briar patch in Iraq. I mean, Iraq went south very quickly. Then what happened was, as they got deeper and deeper into Iraq, the war in Afghanistan started to go south. If there was any chance of winning in Afghanistan, by the way, I do not believe there was any chance of winning in Afghanistan. I think we were doomed from the start. But I may have been wrong. As I hate to admit, I am occasionally wrong. But it is true. I might have been wrong here. We might have been able to win in some meaningful sense in Afghanistan. But that was only by staying there and getting the job done. It was not by going off to Iraq. By going off to Iraq, not only did you guarantee that you were jumping into a briar patch in Iraq, you guaranteed that you would lose in Afghanistan. And that's where we're at now. Okay? So what I'm saying to you is we made a fundamental miscalculation about what you could do with military force in a place like Iraq or a place like Afghanistan. And again, for those of you who are too young to really remember this, you want to go back and read about the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine was not simply about Iraq. It was about transforming the entire Middle East. And it was about transforming the entire Middle East because of that answer that the Bush administration came up with to the important question of why they hate us. Once you believe they hate us because of who we are, the incentives to transform the region are very great. And then go back to Krauthammer and Fukuyama. So those were two big mistakes. The third mistake, which is in many ways the most surprising of all, is these boys and girls actually believed that it would be easy to spread democracy in the Middle East. Academics, as many of you know, hardly ever agree on anything. You get 5 academics in a room, you get 6 opinions on every subject. Right? The literature, right? We talk about cumulativity, right? You know, when we've done 5 studies on this subject, we all agree, we put it over here. We solve this problem, we put it over here. We're accumulating knowledge. It's not the way the social sciences work. Cumulativity. We never agree on anything. One of the few things we agree on, there have been lots of studies done, is that it is very, very hard to create democracy in other countries. It is very hard to spread democracy. And furthermore, it is extremely hard to spread democracy at the end of a rifle barrel. We have a rich history of trying, because as you know, the United States has been intervening here, there, and everywhere for a long time. So we have a lot of experience. 2 prominent political scientists, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and George Downs, wrote a piece in the Los Angeles Times, an op-ed, where they said, between World War II and the present, the U.S. intervened more than 35 times in developing countries around the world. In only one case,
Colombia after the American decision in 1989 to engage in the war on drugs. In only one case did a full-fledged, stable democracy emerge within 10 years. That's a success rate of less than 3%. This is not an anomalous finding. The literature is filled with studies that make the same point using different databases and different criteria for assessing what is or is not a democracy. But there is an overwhelmingly clear consensus that spreading democracy at the end of a rifle barrel is a remarkably difficult task. So here we go, charging into Iraq, a country that has all sorts of centrifugal forces at play down below. Whatever you think of Saddam Hussein, there was no way he could run that country unless he had an iron fist, right? Because of those centrifugal forces. We're going to knock off Saddam. We're going to unleash those centrifugal forces. Right? And furthermore, because we're a bunch of Westerners intervening in the country in the Middle East, in an area where there's a rich history of Western intervention and deep resentment towards the West for those past interventions, we're going to run into trouble. Right? It's going to be a nationalist backlash against us. It just comes with the territory. And furthermore, spreading democracy, even when those circumstances are absent, is really difficult. So, we go in there, and what happens? We end up in the briar patch. We end up in the briar patch. What does that mean? That means the Bush Doctrine has crashed and burned in Iraq. No way you can do Iran, no way you can do Syria, because you can't float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. You understand that if we had won a quick and decisive victory in Iraq, we would have reloaded the shotgun and done Iran or Syria next. That was the Bush Doctrine. When you think you can win quick and easy victories, you do it. You do it because it looks easy. I often say to people with regard to Iranian nuclear weapons, right? First of all, I don't believe Iran is developing nuclear weapons. I agree with the American intelligence community that it's not. But let's just say that Iran was developing nuclear weapons, and I don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. If you told me that you had a magic formula for using precision-guided munitions to take out Iran's nuclear capability, and you could do that permanently, once you took out its nuclear capability, it's gone for good, I'd do it. I'd actually run around the world taking out everybody's nuclear capability. Because as a good realist, I want a world where there's only one country that has nuclear weapons. Us, the United States. Right. But the point is, nobody in their right mind believes that you can go into Iran and easily take out their nuclear capability, or that you can do it for the long term. Even the war hawks in the United States and in Israel acknowledge that the best you can do is delay their acquiring nuclear weapons for 3 to 5 years. You can't solve this problem permanently, and a war is going to produce a giant mess. That's why war is not very attractive. But if you don't believe that, you believe you've found the magic formula, which is what the Afghan model told us incorrectly, right? You're off to the races. So you see what happens here is that after September 11th, the United States designs to widen the target set. Decides to widen the target set. And the terrorist target set. We have the global war on terror. And furthermore, we come to the conclusion that we have this military instrument that can do all sorts of wonderful things. And number 3, we come to the conclusion that it's easy to spread democracy. And all of these judgments are misguided. And the end result is we're in the giant mess that we are facing today in the United States. Now, let me conclude with a few words about my preferred grand strategy. My preferred grand strategy, as I said before, would be for the United States to act as an offshore balancer, just to take the Persian Gulf. I'd get everything, almost everything, out of the region, and I'd put it on ships. I'd put it over the horizon, And I'd make sure you had a capability to go into the region if it was absolutely necessary. But otherwise, I would stay out. And the only thing I would worry about is one country possibly dominating all of the region, be that Iran or a resurgent Iraq. But I would get out. I think, however, that is unlikely to happen, in large part because the United States has this powerful liberal imperial impulse hardwired into it these days. It includes neoconservatives on the right and liberal imperialists on the left. And it's hard to see us adopting a more restrained foreign policy. I think the only thing that could push us in that direction, pursue a more restrained foreign policy, is the budget deficit. I think that given how much economic trouble the United States is in, it may be the case that in the future we just decide we can no longer afford these imperial adventures. And in that case, we would pull our horns in. I just say with some sadness that I am not too hopeful that that would be realized. So with that, I'll stop and I'll gladly take questions for as long as Brian permits me, or if you ask questions.